Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today, we have the most famous and prolific solar podcaster with over 700 episodes. Guess who that is? Drum roll, please. It is Nico Suncast Johnson. Welcome to the show, Nico.
I could say that that is the first time I've ever been introduced like that, Sean. Thank you so much. It's really an honor. I feel like it's an honor for me to be on your show. In many ways, I think that you're more recognizable and well-known than I am.
We'll have to argue about that then, because you're pretty well known. When I was on your podcast from the NABCEP conference, I woke up that morning and I had all these text messages and stuff going
that's
like,
so sweet.
Man, you were on Nico's podcast, and Carly sent me a text of a goat image because you were calling me the goat and all this stuff. So you're the goat.
Yeah, you are.
Podcasters.
I think you are.
Yeah.
I think you are. Bill Brooks would probably be angered by me saying that you're the goat.
Well, we're a team, so it's like I don't exist without him. You know, I'll let him say that about me if he wants to.
That's really cool.
But yeah, we were just at his house recording all day yesterday, and I actually learned a lot of my stuff from Bill because, you know, he's been at it for longer than the sun's been in the sky. And so like I remember when I first was teaching solar and stuff like that, he would teach these classes for Pacific Gas and Electric at the Pacific Energy Center.
At the Pacific Energy Center.
Yeah, and I would go to his same class. It was called Inspecting PV Systems for Code Compliance. I probably went like 5 or 10 times.
No way.
Over and over again. And it's like each time I learned more. And then actually one time at one of those classes, this is kind of a crazy story. I met a guy in the bathroom when I was talking to somebody, and that got me a job at Fidelity Roof Company working with Stuart Wentworth, who invented Quick TV.
I love Stuart.
So I used to always joke about, you know, you got to keep networking, even in the San Francisco bathrooms. You never know who you're going to meet.
That's Eco Stu. Big shout out to Stuart Wentworth, man. Stuart was one of my earliest friends in the solar industry back when I was living in Monterey and he was in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, and he's still around. He took me, I think it was right before COVID was a thing. He took me to a Santana and War concert over at where the Warriors play and all that. So that's
super cool.
That was pretty awesome. But yeah, it was a lot of fun working with him. And then it was Fidelity Roof Company, these high-strung roofers that were just like, you know, we got to get this done, and where's the warranty and all this stuff. And I can remember one day Stuart walking in with a tie-dye and Birkenstocks an hour late, getting balled out. And then he ended up being so successful with his quick mount selling out that he could probably go make them an offer tomorrow and buy it up, do it like what Elon Musk did to Twitter, but actually a lot quicker than that. So
that's fun.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that you're here. And I was just wondering too, I was trying to scroll through your podcasts and I couldn't do it. You had too many.
Good luck with that. Yeah.
And I'm like, man, maybe I could get a list where it just has the name of the person you introduced. And I was like trying that on ChatGPT and Spotify and going to, you know, different places just to get a list of all the names.
Yeah.
But I thought I'd just even ask you, like, who are some of the top people that you had? I know you've had people like Jigger Shaw.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows who he is. I don't have to explain.
Yeah.
A governor from New Jersey, Christine Todd Whitman.
Yeah, former EPA administrator.
Yeah, like super awesome. And then Mary Powell, of course, and she used to run Green Mountain Power, and she was running Sunrun. I know recently you had Abby Hopper from SIA on there, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch. So,
oh man, I could go through, I mean, it's 700 and I think we're at maybe 12 or 13 right now when we're recording this. And, you know, when I started the podcast, I had the intention, I said, you know, I want to do 1,000 episodes.
Well, you're a pretty good part of the way there. Yeah.
I'm getting there. Big chunk. And I didn't realize it would take a decade, to be honest, Sean. I also didn't think at the time that it would turn into a full-time business. Mm-hmm. I was working at Conergy, and in the, sort of the latest iteration of Conergy when it was bought by Kawa Capital Management out in Miami. I was living there. Kawa, in fact, was a client of ours at Trina when I was helping.
Yeah, so you work for Conergy and Trina and all these other places.
Yeah, and podcast just was a thing that captured my attention because I saw it as a way to build rapport, build a personal brand, and also share with the world. And I've said this since the very beginning, a way to kind of pull back the veil. A lot of folks look at the way the solar industry is developed, the way utility scale projects are developed, the way that solar products work as a little bit of a black box. And there is this curtain between the average, even industry participant, and those who are in the know making decisions and moving the industry forward. And I found myself in a privileged position to know those folks, to be interacting with them on a regular basis, and realize that the podcast gave me a vector to get them into an intimate, vulnerable conversation where they would share their secrets. And I feel like those secrets don't need to be secrets. They need to be tools in the toolkit of every participant in our industry. And so I've dedicated myself for the last 9+ years, 700+ episodes, to try and find folks that I believe are truly doing something remarkable in the industry and help, through the interview style, help them share in a way that makes them approachable, relatable, and also unpacks that intellectual property in their head in a way that others can then take and run with it. And I've got stories of folks that have listened to interviews that we've done and gone off and built partnerships with the company that was interviewed, or built businesses to compete because they kind of now understand like aha moments of how the industry works. A few of the folks that stand out for me, though, it's interesting. You mentioned Mary Powell. I thought that episode, which originally I interviewed Mary back in the early spring, we usually do an all-women lineup in March for Women's History Month, and she was the lead-off episode for March of 2022, I think. And in February of 2022, I interviewed a friend of mine whose company I had invested in, a company called NZinc. And that guy's Michael Burrs. He's a literal rocket scientist. He worked on the Tomahawk missile. If you haven't listened to that episode, I remember, Sean, and you'll appreciate this as a podcaster, like I remember walking away from that episode when I pressed stop and like got out of it and walked into the kitchen. I looked at my wife and I said, this was the best interview I've ever done.
Awesome. And so what was the person's name again?
His name is Michael Burrs, Burz.
Michael Burrs. When we're done, I'm going to go listen to that.
Please. Yeah, it's a fantastic interview.
I have a rocket scientist in my class right now, and I have had another one, and I'm like, that's pretty cool, but yeah.
It's amazing. To my surprise though, Sean, you might have thought this person that very few people knew, Michael Burrs, working on a technology that still was not like actually productized, it wasn't actually like formally commercialized, would have gotten minuscule attention compared to Mary Powell, who ran Green Mountain Power, who had just recently at that time taken over Sunrun as the CEO. She'd been on the board many years prior. But the reality is in 2022, the #1 downloaded episode was Michael Burrs, that NZinc product. And I think the reason is this fascination that we have with batteries and how batteries are going to basically turn this whole thing into dispatchable 24/7 renewable energy, right?
Great. So when you were talking to the rocket scientist, what was the topic?
So they developed basically a rechargeable lead acid battery.
Wow.
And in the episode, we go through what the technology is, why I invested in the company, and how they have been working with the Department of Energy and the U.S. Navy, because it was actually developed under the U.S. Navy, and they effectively can turn lead acid batteries, and think of the millions of applications for this, but also the millions of currently in existence lead acid batteries. They can turn lead acid batteries into rechargeable products that are no longer being thrown away. And it's a great example that, Sean, without the podcast, I wouldn't have met Michael Burrs. And it is one of the most transformational ideas that I've seen come across my desk in the 9 years that I've done the podcast. I mean, I could give you example after example of companies that have really impressed me. That's the one that stands out as potentially the most unexpected surprise.
Yeah, there's another rocket scientist in the industry, or actually a couple more. So there's that one that has the electric car company that we all know of that sent a roadster into space, which is kind of cool to have a sports car up there in orbit.
I just came back from Florida yesterday to see the Falcon Heavy launch the GOES-U satellite into space with my son yesterday.
Oh, I'd have loved to have been there.
Yeah, or it was Tuesday. It was fantastic. It's something that you got to see.
Yeah, one time I was out in Florida and I was going to do that, and then it didn't happen. Yeah, there's a guy named Sasha Deary who was the CEO of Alt-E. Do you know Alt-E store? And actually they just closed, is a rumor that I heard. I shouldn't be spreading rumors, but...
How do you spell Deary? I'm going to look it up.
Oh, Deri.
Deri. So I remember Alt-E because it's been around. Oh, Sasha Deri, Deary. Yeah, Alt-E store.
Yeah, real nice guy.
I haven't met Sasha, which is crazy because Alt-E's been around since the last century. I think they started at the end of the 90s. And it was one of those when you and I were getting our feet wet in the solar industry that like Alt-E was one of the powerhouse early web commerce, like e-commerce.
Yeah, and then they bought Real Goods.
Did they really?
Yeah, they bought Real Goods. And so then it was Alt-E and Real Goods. And they were having me come out there every year to do their conference, to do the NEC workshop.
Yeah.
And then, like the last year they didn't have it. And I was asking around, and I guess somebody that was working there said, yeah, they're closing. I think their website's still up.
Yeah, it's up right now.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Sasha's profile page. What a tragedy to see these companies.
Yeah, it's just like a piece of history.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we do, Sean, you and I talked offline, and I thought it was really appropriate the way that you phrased kind of what your podcast is about. I do feel like we have the honor of capturing for history the stories of the innovators, that created an industry that is revolutionizing the way we generate and deliver power.
Yeah, I think that this industry is making such a fast change. And you and I and the people in the industry, we don't see it going that fast because we're just seeing it day to day, minute to minute, and all that kind of stuff. And when people are going to be looking back on this, they're going to be like, Nico and Sean, they made a bigger difference than the president, you know?
Oh man, I don't even know if I've ever even hoped or thought of having that kind of an impact. I do believe that we have a big impact in the way people think about the possibility that's available to them and the pathway to either a career or a business that affects change in our world.
Yeah, and then these old timers and things like that. Like I just interviewed, one of them, and I've interviewed a couple of them. So not too long ago, I had Ike Weber.
Dude, Ike is a legend.
Yeah, and so I'm totally proud of that. He's actually a friend of mine too. He's been out on my
That's
sailboat.
so
Me and
awesome.
Bill own a sailboat. And I interviewed him for Herman Scher's birthday, and he was a friend of Herman Scher, who started the solar industry pretty much.
Yeah.
German politician a lot of people in the US don't know about. And I just had Ezra Auerbach on.
Oh,
Like I didn't release it
Ezra's
yet
another legend.
at
Yeah.
the time of this recording, but just documenting these things. And I know that, I mean, out of your 700, you have a ton of these people.
Hmm.
And, it seems to me that this kind of digital stuff that we're doing is going to be like there forever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably going to last longer than things like that were carved into stone,
Yeah.
thousands of years ago
Yeah.
in perfect form, because it'll just like one copy makes a million, and then storage is going to be free pretty much in the future
Yeah.
compared to, other things. And so I think that it's just a really good way to document things for the future.
Sean, you mentioned earlier that I've been prolific, and I was very intentional about the way that I launched the podcast and how I've carried it throughout the years. But one of the early pieces of advice I got was that, with few exceptions in the art world, artists that we admire today, the Rembrandts, the Picassos, they're not admired for a piece of art. Yes, the Mona Lisa is unbelievable. The Starry Night is transfixing if you like that particular style, but the prolific nature of their art, the fact that they showed up again and again and again, that they did it day in and day out, is why we know the great artists of the Renaissance, because they changed the way people thought about how art was made, who it was for, and what it was about. And I think that with the technological innovations that we've seen through digital archiving effectively, the footprint that I leave and that you leave in a digital format presents a part of a picture that helps tell the story of how the energy landscape was transformed from the late 90s, really the 70s, but let's talk about like the aughts when you and I first started getting in, which I consider to be kind of solar 2.0, the second wave. The incredible change because of the introduction of the low cost curve of solar panels and then battery storage and then inverter technology, the ability for us to really transform the energy landscape. Us capturing that in digital form, now with AI coming on board, it will get integrated into the master brain, right?
Yeah.
So the more we create of heartfelt, positive stories that really do tell the truth of how this industry was created, who the pioneers were, their story won't get lost. Their story makes an impact and it will get integrated. I'm starting to see now things from Suncast, and we've seen this through the years through SEO, but I'm starting to see things from Suncast populate into ChatGPT search results, right? And certainly Google search results. And Google is prioritizing audio and video over text. So I say podcast is the new blog, and how we position these narratives with really good hooks, with really good storytelling, will impact whether or not our story is told in a way that is true to the reality of the pioneers that made it happen.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point. I love just talking to some of these old timers, and like I got to be on the NABCEP exam committee with one of them that I'm still trying to get on the podcast. And he endorsed one of my books and things like that. Ward Bauer, he invented the grid tie inverter in 1977, and like
No way.
super
Wow.
nice guy. And I'd love to document him. I was trying to get John Wiles. Do you know John Wiles?
I don't know John. I know of John, obviously.
Yeah, and he was like the solar code guru, and back in the day when I was learning all this stuff. I was trying to get him to do it. I'll still be working on that one.
Man, I hope you can get Ward.
Yeah.
I thought about having Hart on, but he's a little bit of a divisive personality, Hart Akerson.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know Hart, the Hart Transverter.
Oh, yeah. I know about the Hart inverter. I didn't realize that that was named after somebody.
Yeah, it was named after Hart Akerson. So the Hart Inverter, which became Trace, which became Xantrex, like all the companies that Outback, they all sort of spawned from this company, the Hart Inverter. And he's been down in Costa Rica now for more than a decade, probably 20 years-ish, tinkering new
Hunt
technologies.
them down, bribe them, something like that.
Well, I'd have to go. I mean, he would do it. He would do it virtually. He invited me down to
Oh,
his
great.
place in Costa Rica to do it, which is
Oh, that'd be
why would I
fun.
say no to
Hey,
that?
that's a good excuse. I'm always
I,
looking for
I just
excuses.
wonder, I guess, Sean, I wonder sometimes because the way we publish, once a week, these executive profiles kind of get 52 shots a year to capture the attention of folks. And I do find myself longing to tell the story of the Sam Vanderhoofs of the world, the people that have been around for ages and really saw how the industry formed in like the Solar 1.0. But we still have to fight with this 6-second attention span of modern society. And we have to build an audience. And so we have this constant tension between tell the story of how the industry formed versus tell the story of how the industry is. And a lot of folks gravitate towards the narrative of my interview with John Berger at Sonova or my interview with
Yeah,
Mary Powell
very
and
historical, John
Raghu
Berger.
Beller at Enphase, right? Like people gravitate towards those that are more sort of newsworthy now. And I find that, I don't know, do you find that tension as you're trying to create the podcast as well of how you pick who you're going to interview?
You know, your podcast is your main thing. So
Mm-hmm.
I know you spend a lot more time on it than I do. And so mine just kind of evolved. And it started out with me just putting stuff for my classes and going like, oh, I could
Yeah.
post it here. I think it was actually even started off with me just reading the NEC. Like 690 came out, I'm going to read it. And I posted on my
Oh my
website.
God, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I tried to read it like poetry, like greetings and readings from the National Electrical Code, 690.1 scope. And then,
That's hilarious. Have you talked about this with Tor? Because Tor is like probably True Solar Stories is the closest we've got to like, narrative storytelling in the solar industry right now. But that's a really creative approach.
I don't know if I talked to him about the specific subject, but I know I've had Tor Solar Fred Valenza. He's been on the podcast and he's
Oh,
an awesome
wonderful.
dude. I got him to be on the NorCal Solar Board. I talked him into it some years ago. But yeah, anyway, just going back to where we were, mine just kind of evolved from that. And then I was like posting my stuff. In fact, what was kind of funny is the other day, Bill and I were sailing, and I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to talk to Nico on my podcast, and I'm going to talk to Ezra on the podcast next week. And he was like, you have a podcast? He's not a podcast watcher, I guess. And I was like, yeah, you've been on it.
That's
I
awesome.
think I told you about it.
Yeah. You've done a lot of firsts like I have. I've had a bunch of folks kind of like you have that have said, oh, this is my first ever podcast. Like, this is the first time I've done this.
Yeah, and so I don't have a sponsor. I just try to promote my classes with it. And so I was just putting pieces of my classes on there. And then I
Right.
started getting these marketing firms sending going like, can we put so and so on your podcast? And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. And then I was, get some CEOs on here and stuff like that. And it kind of took off on its own, but I have so much to do. I haven't really spent much time chasing after people. But as far as like
Yeah.
what you're doing, how do you get these people? Does it just come to you or do you come to them? Like you get like Jigger Shaw.
Well, let me tell you, I'll tell you a funny story about Jigger. So it's a kind of a two-part answer, and I'll take the sort of the Jigger Shaw, Dan Sugars of the world as an aside, we'll take it a slight departure from the norm. But generally speaking, the first 100 episodes were like, let me go ask as many of my close friends that I know who are in the C-suite as possible. And I'm fortunate because I had a decade of experience in the industry and I'd worked at some of the biggest companies. So I actually did know a lot of the folks that over time, and this is the value of dedicating yourself to an industry, if not a company, but an industry for more than a decade, is that a lot of people that I started out in the industry with, the Noah Eckerts of the world, had risen to leadership positions, the Daniel Deuces. I mean, I could name a long laundry list of folks that now are running their own companies or running publicly traded companies who we started out together kind of on the trading floor, if you will, out on the front lines. And so I am able to kind of pick and choose, as it were, in the first 300 or 400, 500 episodes, it was me going and knocking on doors of people that I thought would be really interesting and who were hard to get. They had to have that vector of hard to get, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of folks pitch me, can I be on your show? And I would say less than 50% I said yes to, either because I was worried that it wouldn't generate attention or the company may fail or they just weren't doing anything that was particularly interesting enough to merit kind of one of those 52 slots a year that I get. And a lot of marketing teams have reached out over the years. I'll tell you, like one of the things I'm most, it was kind of, wow, I can't believe I just got this opportunity. The marketing team for Robert Piccone at Energy Vault and Christy Obiaya at Heliogen, who are both spin outs from a well-known incubator in California, they reached out and said, would you like to have them on? We had them on, I guess, last year. So that was kind of like, I don't know, after 500 or 600 episodes, I finally get the marketing teams calling to ask me if I want someone that's on my like hit list.
Uh-huh.
It took a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the core answer is perseverance. There are a lot of podcasters out there who I've heard them say, oh, this person keeps blowing me off, or this person won't pay attention. And they forget that as communicators, we are a channel, a vector for them to do something else. They don't really care about being on our show so much as they care about sharing their message in a way that's going to get to a larger audience. And so I had to build credibility. I had to build an audience and a reputation for treating people with respect and asking the right questions and being inquisitive and insightful. Jigger, I met at the Hotel Nico, of all places, in San Francisco
Cool.
in 2000, I think in 9 or 10. And coincidentally, I went to an event where he was a speaker. After the session, after his speaking engagement, we had lunch and he sat down next to me. I mean, it was one of these crazy moments where I couldn't believe Jigger Shaw just sat next to me. At the time, he was still CEO of Sun Edison. And so I just kept in touch with him. I said, hey, I'm sort of young in the industry. I started in 2006. I had my first failure. I started a company that failed in the global financial crisis. I'm now working at this roofing company. We're trying to make it work. Sun Edison is a partner of ours. We're really honored to work with you guys. Can I keep in touch with you? So through the years, Jigger and I have actually developed a friendship. He literally called, like texted me and said, can you help us with the Biden clean energy ball, like the inaugural ball for the clean energy sector? And I said no. And if anybody kind of knows Jigger, Jigger doesn't like no. So he just kept calling me.
You turned him down.
And calling me until I said yes. Yeah. But Jigger's the kind of person that he has a very specific thing he wants to talk about, a very specific message. And he wants to be generous with his time, so long as he can identify the path to audience, right? Like, who are we going to speak to? What is it that we're going to do? And then he is going to go, I don't want to use the word carpet bomb, but he's going to go like value bomb a ton of different podcasts because he wants to spread the message far and wide, right? I've tried to limit folks like Jigger, who I love, on the show because I don't want Suncast to be another podcast that they're doing. I don't want it to be the same message on my show that it is on every other show. And so I want to make sure that I can get into kind of the heart of who they are and what it is that's driving them and how others can really feel like they could put themselves in the shoes of that person and take life lessons away from that person's career and apply it to their business, their career, and be, kind of replicate what Jigger or Dan or Mary or Abby Hopper have done.
Well, you're welcome to send any of those people my way if you only got 52.
That's a deal, Sean. If anybody, I will send them your way, my friend. Anybody who, whether I have them on or not, I would do a like-kind exchange. There are folks that you've interviewed, man, that I want to interview. Like Ezra is someone that I would absolutely love to have on the show and haven't had a chance to really make it work.
Okay, well, I'll probably be talking to him soon. I could let him know.
Very cool.
So when you're interviewing some of these people, do you spend a whole lot of time preparing? Do you get nervous? Especially the famous people. And I know too, like for me, teaching, interviewing, and all that kind of stuff, sometimes I'm tired, just like one day I wake up more tired than the next. Some days I'm more funny than the next. What's your experience?
Yeah. So what I think I understand that you're asking is, how do you show up in a way that really gets the best out of the guest and where you have consistently high energy? Because I usually do. And also how much prep goes into it so that you feel confident instead of insecure. So I'm going to answer those in order that I just described it. I have really struggled with managing my energy and my time. And the way that I've found that maximizes my availability, and this is different for when I do a virtual interview like we're doing now versus when I do an in-person interview, is I carve out only podcast interview times. Like right now, what we're doing is in my only podcast interview time. It's Wednesdays and Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. And I'm mentally available. And I have a few rituals. I have a few levers. A couple of ways that I show up is I have these sort of mechanical levers. I use this product that's got a bunch of adaptogens in it called Magic Mind. And it's a subscription. I literally order it on autopilot every month. And I drink it along with my coffee. And it helps me have more mental acuity.
Wow.
I tell everybody this and I don't mind, and I don't get any sort of affiliate income for it.
What's in it?
So it's a bunch of different adaptogens. It's called Magic Mind. Yeah, I actually do have an affiliate code if anybody wants to use it. But I also take Alpha Brain by On It. And this is like one of the Joe Rogan products. And I remember a friend of mine, I walked into the show floor at Inner Solar 2018. And it was Thursday and everybody else was just dead tired and zonked out from partying, and I was my normal energetic self. And he said, I don't know what you're on, but I want some. And I literally had some in my pocket. So I pulled it out. I pulled out Alpha Brain and I gave him some. And he was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because it does help with memory and focus, and it does help with
I'll
clarity.
try it.
Yeah. And so I follow a lot of folks that do engage in biohacking. And I mean, there are numerous ones. Dave Asprey is the guy who kind of turned me on
Yeah,
to,
I'm kind of into all that stuff too.
yeah. So nootropics and adaptogens, stuff like that, like Dave Asprey, Tim Ferriss, these guys all turn me on to it. And I kind of spend a fair amount of time thinking about how to optimize my body and longevity. And I've decided that I want to live past 100.
Yeah, me too. I'm totally into that.
So since nobody in my family's ever lived past 100, and I've already set big goals for myself.
Yeah, I have a longevity doctor.
Yeah. So I'm focused on that. So that's the energy piece. And then the research part, Sean. So I'm a procrastinator, typical ADHD person, but I know how to research really quickly. I usually set aside about an hour ahead of the interview. I do a deep dive into a person's LinkedIn. And I'll tell you one cool research hack, Sean, that I think very few people use, and it's served me super well. This is more of an interview thing, but you can do this for any conversation you're going to have with anybody. You find out using LinkedIn what university they went to. And if they're of note, like I'll tell you, Robert Piccone, this was fantastic. Notre Dame did a bio on Robert for their Notre Dame alumni newsletter. I've found more gold digging into like alumni newsletters of successful alumni that I'm interviewing than anywhere else. So I usually will search like, Notre Dame, Robert Piccone, whatever, insert university and insert guest name and alumni. And there's a ton of personal information there. I remember Ed Feo, remember Ed? So when he was running Coronal, I did that same thing and learned that he's super into sailing. And so
me too.
It was very relatable. At the very beginning, we talked about racing sailboats, and he was completely, instantly at ease. And I think that's the third piece, Sean, is no matter how much research one does, and this is applicable to a sales meeting, an internal team meeting, or podcast interview, if you recognize how to set someone at ease and build that instant rapport, then the rest of the conversation flows. Because my goal is to help someone feel like they could tell me anything. The absolute best thing someone can tell me in a podcast interview is, I never told anybody this before. That's when I know I've gotten to the meat, the heart of the matter.
Okay, and tell us something you never told anybody before. Yes. So I thought it was kind of interesting too, just the things that you and I have in common that we just discovered today. Some of it was before we started. So we just talked about longevity. So we're into that, biohacking and all that kind of stuff. You mentioned Tim Ferriss. I used to listen to his podcast a lot more. And then we also discovered that we both crashed trucks on the way to our SAT exams.
It's like the most random simultaneous data fact.
Yeah, and that came from you bumped your leg on the way to the mic this morning, and so I was like, oh, that'll improve our call because the cortisol.
I think it did actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it activated some receptor that makes us more attuned.
We'll have to remember that next time. If I ever interview Jigger or something like that, I'll smash my toe, something like that.
There you go. It's really interesting. You mentioned Tim Ferriss and smashing toes. So one of the things that I somehow deeply remember is this speaking hack for him. Somebody asked him, how do you kind of get in the zone before you go on the stage? And he literally will smack himself in the back of the neck, like pow, 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 like 3 times to like wake him up, like get those receptors firing and pull him into the present moment and out of like being inside of his head and really thinking about it. And yeah, I do that sometimes. If you guys come to the Power Up Live stage at RE Plus and you kind of watch me off to the side before I'm going up, like I'm definitely in the zone of like getting myself ready for the next interview. And sometimes I will just like smack myself to kind of get myself back to the present moment.
So have you ever seen the Da Vinci Code, like self-immolation? Is that what they call it?
Yeah. Yep. Opus Dei. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing that we had in common that I didn't realize, that we were both on the board of NorCal Solar. And so right now I'm the president of NorCal Solar. We just had our 50th anniversary. So this year's our 50th year. So that was pretty awesome.
I wish I could have been there too. Yeah. Elaine was the president for a long time. And while I was there, Noah Eckert, in fact, the guy I mentioned, he convinced me, like you did for Tor, he convinced me to join the board back in, I think it was like 2010, 2009 when I was in Oakland.
Yeah, it looks like I'm looking at your LinkedIn right now. So it said 2011 to 2012.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. And then I got on the board in 2014 and I was part of it during those years, but I think I was just traveling a lot at those times. So I didn't see what was going on as much. But yeah, we just kind of missed each other on the board. I'm sure we were hanging out. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
Well, Sean, one of the things that you bring up that I think is worth touching on, a lot of folks probably don't know what NorCal Solar is. It's the Northern California regional affiliate for the American Solar Energy Society, otherwise known as ASUS. How has ASUS evolved in the 10 years since you've been a part of NorCal Solar, and why is it still relevant as an agency in a time where the industry is rapidly evolving?
Yeah, so I know I first became active with ASUS when I met Stuart Wentworth. And so when we were working at that roofing company, and then you said you worked at a roofing company, so we have that in common too. And so his wife, Claudia Wentworth, who's also famous, that co-started Quick Mount and all that kind of stuff, she was the president. And so I was going to their meetings and stuff like that. And it was a lot of fun. It was pretty active. And so, of course, they were an ASUS chapter. And I remember going to the ASUS conferences, like in, I think 2007 or 8 was my first one. They were a lot bigger. And then they had one down in North Carolina, where you are. And I think what happened is they had maybe some board problems or something like that. And somebody told me they reserved a whole bunch of hotel rooms that didn't fill up and had to pay a whole bunch of money because they were, saw that they had this huge growth and they expected it to happen, and maybe it didn't happen. I'm not sure, that might be wrong, but there was a huge change and they had some financial problems and stuff like that. And part of it too, I think, might have to do with just the conference competition and SEIA winning the game. And then Intersolar being there too. And so it has evolved over the years. It was a lot bigger and a lot different until something like 2011 or something around that time period. 2012, I'm not sure. I remember there was a big one in Phoenix, and then North Carolina was the last sort of big one. And then they kind of piggybacked on the Intersolar in San Francisco. And that's sort of how it's evolved. But it's also like pretty much the first solar organization, unless you include Ra and the Egyptians, and that's a pretty old solar organization.
It is.
There's probably some caveman one too. And 1954, the solar cell, 70 years ago. And then ASUS and International Solar Energy Society, which they've always called ISIS. I don't know if we should say that, but that's what they've always been called. And they kind of started together as the same organization, I think is how you should put it. And then the International Solar Energy Society is kind of, branched off, and they're different than the American Solar Energy Society. There's a lot of the same people. And so I'm actually lifetime members of both.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. One thing that was kind of cool is with the International Solar Energy Society, Dave Renee, who was the president at the time, he hooked me up, and I went to the COP27 in Egypt and did a talk there. That was
very cool. So you went on behalf of ISIS.
Yeah, and they actually had somebody else from like a different organization, like geothermal, like share their ticket with me. But they're the ones that got me there. And then I got to meet a whole bunch of people. It was pretty cool. And so NorCal Solar, I'm applying to go to COP, but it's like to be one of the observers, they call it. And it's a long process. It's like years. So I'm working on that.
I should apply for 25. I'm not going to be able to go 24. I think 25 is closer to home.
Well, there's going to be one that's going to be in Brazil that I might.
Brazil, I think, is 25. Yeah. That's the one I'd really like to go to.
We'll get you back on the NorCal Solar board, and you could join me. Yeah.
There you go.
I think you get like 2 people can go.
Amazing. Yeah. It might be worth reconsidering. I was really honored to have, just to tie the bow on the ASUS conversation, they had their annual conference, or their annual sort of member meeting, I think it was, in March, and invited me to do a keynote. And that was my first time being invited to do a keynote. Can you believe that?
Well, I can't believe it, but that's cool.
Yeah. And so I talked about the power of storytelling and how everybody here is a part of helping grow the industry. We're not watching Jigger or Abby or Dan Sugar or Mary Powell. We're not watching them create the industry. Like, they are inspiring us to tell our story. And I think that one of the beauties of mediums like podcast and YouTube is that the gatekeepers are gone. Content is something that everybody can create. Sean, you make it on the side, and you prove my point that you could be a full-time instructor, trainer, traveler, speaker, and still produce content that helps people educate themselves and that changes their mind and that provides them insight into where they fit into all this. So I think that the fundamental underlying piece of why anybody presses play on any of this content, including this episode, is a voice in the back of their head that is asking, am I doing this right? Right? It's like, it's really subtle, and few people want to admit that that's the underlying question they're trying to answer. Like, am I doing this right? What can I learn? Why do you listen to My First Million? Right? My buddy David Banyalba, it's like, why do I listen to My First Million? Because in some way I'm curious what they're going to say about how the world is working today and what I'm going to learn about AI and what I should think about outside of the sphere of solar industry that might help me do this in a more effective way or a more efficient way. Maybe there's somebody I should know at this company. Maybe there's a company that's not on my radar that's going to help me think more clearly about how I show up in the world.
Great. So, one thing that I was just thinking recently too is another way of putting, like people talk about climate change or sea level rise or something like that, is to break it down to figure out the distance that the ocean rises for each solar module installed or for each one of our jobs. And it might be a very small amount, 10 to the minus something or other, but it's actually measurable.
Yeah, in terms of how many, the deceleration of sea level rise.
Yeah, how much you prevented it from going up more.
Yeah, I'll tell you, much smarter mind than mine. We'll have to figure that one out.
Okay, well, we'll just say it's 10 to the minus 20 or 10 to the minus 10 meters or something. I don't know, something like that.
There you go.
And so I know we're getting towards the end right now. And so, Nico, are there any storytelling tactics that work no matter what sector you're focused on?
Yeah, I think that the thing about storytelling is that folks think that's something other people do, famous TikTokers and YouTubers, but we all have a story to tell. And I can share a few tactics, as it were, that have worked. But if you think about even Shakespeare, obviously used storytelling tactics that Coca-Cola and other marketers use today. The inciting moment, the rise and fall, the tension that you need to create. That's not something that just is reserved for plays or books or movies. Conversations as simple as having coffee with someone are made more interesting, and certainly in a 6-second world, they're made more approachable if we use certain storytelling tactics. One that I used recently when I interviewed Raghu Beller, that's a slight modification of the tool itself, is the what, so what, then what, or what, so what, now what model. And the what, so what, now what model really helps teams, individuals think about the present activity, everything from how a meeting went or a project or how a business activity is or is not succeeding, in a way that allows you to come away with the takeaways and share those takeaways. So what? Describe the situation that occurred. To so what? Analyze why it matters and its implications. And then now what? Consider the possible next steps and or your insights from the activity that happened. I am using that exact framework I have a newsletter on LinkedIn that we launched earlier in the year called Valence. And it really is about how storytelling is at the heart of everything we do. And a lot of folks are afraid to be storytellers and to integrate storytelling and to share on LinkedIn on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. But yet they want their companies to be known. My personal perspective is that people don't care about companies and brands. They care about the humans that are involved in pushing a technology forward. Dan Sugar is in part popular because Nextracker is a good technology. But if it were just the fact that it's Nextracker, then the best tracker out there, or people would be technology centric. But thousands of people follow Dan Sugar because he's also good at telling the story of how the industry is unfolding. So Dan Sugar is a great example. Nextracker and inverter companies of
guitar player.
He is a great guitar player. But you could talk about the innovation curve. There are actually some ways to think about kind of how you position your message that has to do with where you are on the innovation curve. So your storytelling tactic, if you've identified that you're speaking to an audience that are innovators or pioneers, is going to be different than if you're talking to people who are kind of more traditional or late mainstream adopters of the technology. Early pioneers, you're going to tell them stories about process and breakthroughs and prototypes and things that they can sort of feel like their early insider secret sort of knowledge is valuable to them. And if they're late mainstream, you really want to convey that your product, while it does work for a niche, is now expanding to mainstream and is ready for mass market, right? So Mike Burrs, with his NZync battery technology, has not become mainstream, but lead acid batteries are mainstream. So it's easy for him to extrapolate in a story how his niche technology incubated in the Navy is going to now be ready for mass market and can apply to the millions of lead acid batteries in the world, right? Like that story of innovator sort of overcoming that technology gap is important if he wants to raise money and if he wants to attract people that are more in that late mainstream mindset. So I think a lot of us in the solar industry are on that innovation curve, and we have to think through who is our audience, where are they in their adoption of technology, so that we can speak to them where they are. And then I also wanted to mention that there's an easy way to think about, kind of going back to how Shakespeare and other writers set up a story, and that there's an easy way to kind of think about it in the sense of how do I tell a story is something that if you need on the spot a way to tell a story because somebody asks you for something that kind of feels like you kind of need to package it in a way they'll remember it. And it's the 5 T's. So think about timeline, turning points, tension, temptations, and a teachable moment. And if you can think in that 5 T's framework, then you can turn anything into a story. Think about the beginning, the middle, and end, or even simpler, just the beginning and the end of the story. So at first we did this, and then we tried that, and now we're doing XYZ thing. That's timeline. Turning points are the key moments in the timeline. We realized we had a big problem when X happened, right? It's known as the denouement in sort of traditional storytelling. It's that inciting moment. Tensions are max conflict or anxiety in a story. And actually, this is typically where you want to start a story if you want to really get people's attention. It's known as the hook. So at the start of COVID pandemic, I lost all my clients in 1 week, right? Oh shit, how'd you fix that, right? That's a good tension that you can introduce. So timeline, turning points, and tensions. Temptations are where you show vulnerability or weakness. I was tempted to quit. I could have thrown everything away. I could have been lazy. I could have lied to this client. But instead I did the right thing, or I did the hard thing, right? And that helps to establish both a sort of character and culture. And then obviously the entire purpose of a story is the teachable moment. So my point is, we did this thing, or I'll never forget the moment that we got the contract with this person, or, you know, what this has taught me from all of this experience is, and insert lesson here, right? So if you remember those 5 T's, then you can kind of turn any activity, any conversation into a storytelling opportunity and easily package it. Timeline, turning points, tensions, temptations, and teachable moments. And I figured out recently that those mental models are what people need more than anything else if they want to really embrace this idea that I have that everybody's a storyteller. And that's what I try to use Valence for, is to share with people, like, here's folks that you can follow and models, sort of mental models that you can use to tell your story better, whether you're the frontline marketer at a company that's trying to sell a technology, or you're the CEO trying to sell a story to raise money, or like you and I, you're communicators trying to help build a bridge of knowledge between those who want to be in this industry and those who have been in this industry for a long time. How do we connect those people? And the answer is we tell the right stories. And those stories connect with people and pull them in the direction of seeking more education, seeking partnerships, and ultimately succeeding in their own individual journey.
Awesome. So I have a homework assignment for everybody. So rewind right now until we get back to the beginning of the 5 T's. And I want you to repeat that 10 times until you have 50 T's. And also, Nico, do you have that already in an article somewhere? Like, is there somewhere where you can study this and read it?
Yeah, so I'm publishing this week, in the week that we're recording, the what, so what, now what model in the Valence newsletter. And the next one will be the 5 T's. And I can link to you.
We'll stick it in the show notes.
Yeah, because I think the easiest is for people to just subscribe to that newsletter.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So we're getting about to the end. And I know one thing that you do in your podcast is you always ask about books. So I thought I might ask you something that's sort of like that, but like, what's your favorite non-solar podcasts?
My favorite non-solar podcast, man.
Or even the ones that you listen to. Some of them might be controversial.
Yeah. So I'm a podcast junkie.
I
literally, like, I want to pull this up for you and I'll show you, Sean. Like, my friends think it's insane. Like, this is the number of podcasts that I'm subscribed to right here. I'm just scrolling and scrolling.
Looks like he's got like hundreds, probably.
Hundreds, but I have daily podcasts I listen to. I have business and life favorites. I have a whole like 100+ curated podcasts in the energy and climate sector. Like I'm a legit podcast junkie. I mentioned My First Million. For me, My First Million is one of the best podcasts that has come out in the last 3 or 4 years.
So the My First Million podcast. So
Yeah.
that's like a
Uh,
business podcast.
it's more of a like a life business application podcast by two guys that have one guy, Sam Parr, built and sold the hustle to HubSpot. And they just interview interesting people and they have really interesting takes on how business is unfolding for us right now. I listen to NPR's Up First podcast every day or every other day at least. I listen to, there's another guy, Darren Daly, he has an on demand podcast every day. He created or was the executive producer, I think, for Leadership I can't remember what magazine it was now. I'm completely blanking. But I listen to Darren Daly pretty much every day. I love Darren. And in the energy, honestly, like Chris Nelder's Energy Transition Show is probably the one that I most consistently listen to. I listen to Catalyst because I think Shale Khan is just one of the better interviewers and smarter people in our space. We actually, on the Resource Labs Network, produce or publish Earthlings. I don't know if you know Lisa Ann, but Lisa Ann Pinkerton's podcast, she's a former NPR host and she runs technical communications, but she also produces this podcast called Earthlings 2.0 that we co-produce. And my team tells me that they find a ton of value out of that show. So that's one that I try to listen to as often as I can. And then one that I've been, I think, probably most surprised by, and I think has just incredible amount of depth from an industry related podcast, and I want to just tip my hat to, is John Engel over at Renewable Energy World. We became friends around the time that he launched the Factor This podcast, and I've just been super impressed with his growth. You know, he actually came out of podcasting from ESPN, and he's very serious about it, and I think he does a tremendous job. He and Mike Casey do a fun, like, This Week in Clean Tech every Friday that I think they syndicated on Factor This. I always watch it on LinkedIn. I guess that's a smattering like,
Great.
and I do listen to a ton more podcasts. Like in my feed right now are none of those podcasts and a bunch of others that are just completely not related to the solar industry at all.
Yeah, one I've been listening to a lot lately is Lex Friedman. He's been interviewing a lot of people that are about like galaxies and space, and that's how I fall asleep. Just like take a dip into the Milky Way.
I want to share one right now that I was just turned on to by my business partner, Karen Baran from solaracademy.com. He sent me this one from this guy, Dwarkesh Patel. I'd never heard of this guy, Dwarkesh Patel. He's an Indian guy that is living in Silicon Valley and interviewing a bunch of folks. Like he had Zuckerberg on his show. I'd never heard of this guy. He has 185,000 subscribers on YouTube. He did a 4-hour podcast with this guy, Leopold Aschenbrenner. It's called $1 Trillion Cluster. It is a 4.5-hour podcast.
All right. Breaking records.
It's insane. It's like Joe Rogan level.
Come on, let's do another 4 hours and beat that. Come on, Nico.
That'd be fun. That'd be fun. But we would have to actually be leaning into areas of mind-bending sort of reality that, like, it's 4.5 hours. I rarely dedicate that kind of time, but Karam said, you got to listen to this. Like, this completely challenged me to think more critically about, are we addressing the right problem?
So we'll look for links to all this stuff and stick it in the show notes.
Yeah, fantastic.
I wonder if there's a limit to how long a podcast could be. Like, what if we just did a fundraising marathon podcast for grid alternatives for 24 hours or something like that?
We should totally do this, Sean. I love that idea.
Let's do it.
I also think that attention is the currency of modern society. And the ability for this guy, Dwarkesh, to have 100,000+ people watch a 4.5-hour podcast speaks to value creation. Because I've never even heard of the guest that he had, right? But it's fascinating. A lot of folks say, like, how long is too long? Well, this guy just did 4.5-hour episode. Joe Rogan routinely does 4-hour episodes, 3-hour episodes. It really is about being inquisitive and having insight, and not in a 4-hour episode with Joe Rogan. There's definitely parts that are forgettable, right? But I think the magic of the modern media company is to be able to pull out the insights. That's a lot of what we do now at Suncast, is like work with our clients on how do we pull out the insights. If we do these long interviews, if we do these long sort of capture moments of their intellectual property, and we're going to publish something that maybe 30 or 45 minutes, is there a 30-second clip? That's the hardest part of the whole business model that we are working on at Suncast, is how do you actually capture the insights, the moments that pull people in, the hook. So Russell Brunson has this model, hook, story, offer, right? And the offer could simply be like, leave us a comment of what you think, but that hook, that's another sort of model that people can use for storytelling. Hook, story, offer. The hook is what gets people in. It's like the headline of the blog post, right? It's like the subject line of your email. If you don't have a good subject line, nobody's going to read your freaking email. So I have to get the cover art right on YouTube. I have to get the title right for my podcast episode, or half the audience tunes out. They don't click through and listen to it.
This Saturday, I'm going to go to something called VidCon. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. You're going to VidCon. That's awesome.
Yeah, my daughter's like all of her favorite YouTubers are going to be there, and she's the one that talked me into it. And she's only 9 years old. I'm going to go with a 9-year-old.
Wow.
Yeah, maybe I'll learn something.
That's amazing. Where is VidCon this year?
Anaheim Convention Center. Same place we're going to go to. I'll see you at RE Plus there, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I'll see you at RE Plus. I want to make sure that you have secured your Solar Sean podcast interview slot at the Power Up Live stage. We got to make sure that happens.
All right. Yeah. Let me know what to do.
Yeah, man. The Power Up Live stage this year is going to be, it's where we interview folk and we invite other podcasters. It's in the lobby of Hall E this year at RE Plus. So it's actually like out in front and center. Vartilla Energy Storage and Optimization is our presenting sponsor, and really honored and proud to be able to partner with RE Plus to do that stage. And it came from, Sean, like you and I wanting to interview executives, but having to walk a mile away to a press room and ask somebody else to leave their booth, right? So each year we get closer and closer to the actual trade show floor and giving people a really easy space. By the way, this year we actually have a podcast recording booth in our, like, on site. So we've got our stage, and then in the back we have a podcast recording booth. So more to come on that too. Stay tuned.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, just let me know how to get hooked up with that. Love it. It's very impressive seeing all the podcasting you're doing in your podcast zones at all the conferences, getting all the podcasters together.
Yeah, I think that a rising tide raises all boats.
Yeah. Thanks for rising the tide, Nico.
Yeah, man. I appreciate the work that you're doing as well, my friend. I said it when we published your episode. You are one of the most prolific educators in the sector, and I think that you're doing a tremendous amount of good.
Thank you so much. And your podcast is super educational. I learned everything I know from your podcast, of course. So everybody knows your podcast, but let's just have you tell everybody where to find you.
Yeah, sure. The easiest way to find the podcast in the back catalog is mysuncast.com. It's called Suncast. The podcast is called Suncast. And we're available on iTunes, Spotify, all the major podcast players. Increasingly, we have published every episode as a video podcast on our YouTube channel. So if you search YouTube for Suncast Media, or if you go to YouTube/Suncast Media, I think that's how it works, then for those of you who are video oriented rather than audio, that's where all of our video is. And we've got a bunch of shorts and snippets and things like that for the low attention span folks. So everything is under the banner Suncast Media. Also, if you want to find Earthlings, which I mentioned earlier, you can go to resourcelabs.co. And that is our podcast network, which is not officially launched, but we have Earthlings and a few other podcasts that are onboarding. Honored to count all of you as listeners. And I would ask that if there are folks that you think should be in my podcast or Sean's podcast, please let us know.
Yes.
Fewer people than you would expect actually reach out to us and pitch us on high value conversations. And what we're looking for is to share with the world the educational edutainment content that inspires people to build things in this industry. And building, you could be building your career, not just a business. So build something of meaning that's going to impact the world around you, and then learn how to spread that. And we want to inspire you with that by showing you examples of others who've done it before you.
Yeah, and I'm looking for world leaders, media people, movie stars, all those kind of people. Want to be on my podcast? Let's do it. And Nico too, of course. And also, too, you have a spot on your website where people could find heat spring classes. So how would somebody navigate to that?
I love that. It's mysuncast.com/heatspring, actually. And Sean and I both are big fans of HeatSpring. It's a great way to get up to speed very fast on really any aspect of solar, wind, geothermal. There's classes for all different aspects of energy efficiency, and love everything that Brian and the HeatSpring team are doing. So thanks for that nod there.
Yeah. And then Brian Hayden, the founder of HeatSpring, he's also a great storyteller, and he really is some podcasts that have nothing to do with solar or HeatSpring or anything like that. So you could go search for those yourself if you want to. And any last words?
This episode is chock full of resources. I love it. We're trying to create the taxonomy of the industry and demystify this sector so that others are unafraid to really lean in and build a career of meaning, build the businesses that transform our energy infrastructure. So thanks for everything you're doing, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Nico Suncast Johnson. And thanks for being on Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. To find out more, go to Solar, SEAN, that's solarshawn.com.